Tomato Sauce, and I hope you remember the name. We talked about our model of a classroom. So we focused more on how we can make the education or make the teaching of multimodal communication better in classrooms. And we essentially want to bring theatrical activities and games to classrooms in order to increase the effectiveness of teaching.
Yeah, so overall, what we thought was the things that normally you see in drama classes, different types of activities that are meant to improve your improvisational skills, your acting skills, your ability to communicate with people, could also, that kind of basis of the idea of teaching those, the idea that through a game, through an activity, you can better understand the fundamental concept of what is happening. We thought that those ideas could also be applied to pretty much any other classroom, not necessarily using the same exact games or same exact activities, but carrying over those same ideas and using them in different classrooms.
So how many people here have been in a class that you just really didn't like? Yeah, everybody. Okay, so I feel like we have this epidemic of classes that are just kind of stagnating, right? Like, everybody's been in a class that's really boring. Everybody's had this kind of lecture hall scenario, and our podcast was about how we want to eliminate that kind of idea. Like, we all know that not a lot of people can learn that way. I mean, some people can, but I feel like for the majority of people, by getting active and by engaging in these kind of games and these kind of like maker values of play and creativity, we believe that people will all be more able to learn the material in a deeper sense.
Yeah, so I talked about like positive and negative classroom examples, where like in my positive examples, I was talking about my history class from 8th grade, which some people remember. And so yeah, so in that class, even though it was like 4 years ago, we like had all these paper balls and we throwing them at each other, which was like really cool. And then Alex talked about like some negative examples about how like we sit in class and we read our textbooks or something, and we just end up kind of like zoning out.
And really we focused on the fact that these activities, these games that we had done in our classes had really helped to get us to understand those concepts and help us to keep those concepts in our minds for so long, being able to remember the classes we took in middle school. If you look back, you'll find that the classes you most remember are going to be the ones where you did interesting things in order to learn the material, the places where you really applied what you were doing. And so that's what we focused on as the like reasoning behind why this would be effective.
I mean, while doing the podcast, we came up with an interesting example of a future research, maybe. So it was like, while normally learning in a lecture hall or reading through a book, you might just use normal part of your brain, like normal memory part of your brain. But when you're engaging in activities, you're using your muscle memory as well to remember the same things. So in effect, you're using more memory to learn the same thing. So all in all, you learn more in the same amount of time.
Cool. Questions? All right.
So you guys talked a lot in your podcast about different ways of teaching, like the history example and different interactive ways for the classroom. But I felt sometimes in high school when my teachers tried to incorporate some of that, we got distracted from the subject matter and maybe just started playing a game and not really focusing on the subject. Do you guys feel like there are any situations where a boring lecture is really necessary to convey the information to the students?
I feel like it depends on the classroom environment. I feel like for every situation, you're gonna have to draw the line between your play and your work, I guess. Like for certain classes, like for a lot of English classes, I guess, like there's not a whole lot of lecturing happening for the material that you're learning. There can just be more of this like kind of play idea, but for like a physics class, like you can do cool lab demos and you can do cool games, but I feel like you have to draw the line at where you're actually learning the material in like a more structured way at a different place. So I think it really depends on each situation.
There's also, in that same topic, there's also the idea of how effective the teacher is at controlling the environment and controlling the activity. Because if you have a teacher who is really just adding these activities for the sake of doing them without really having themselves being involved and being interested, it can often come across as the students just sort of going off and doing their own thing. So it really requires, this style of teaching requires a heavy involvement and a heavy interest from the teachers themselves, in order for it to function properly.
All right, there's a question back there.
So kind of bouncing off with what Quinn just asked, I know a lot of the times why we still have lectures and, in high school and secondary school is that there's very limited time that the teachers have with the students throughout the year. And I know a lot of the times our high school would try to do things like what you're talking about, but we just really couldn't fit it into the schedule because we had to get so much information covered for an AP exam or whatnot. How can, is it worth it for the students to get the extra types of learning by doing the other methods, but at the same time sacrificing the time that they could be learning with the professor?
Well, the examinations are based on your knowledge, right? So like today's examinations are based so that you based on what you learn. So suppose you were to learn less, but you wanted to learn better, then the examinations could be designed in a different way to test how in-depth your knowledge is about the subject rather than how vast your knowledge is, like quantitatively. So, I mean, examinations and what you learn in class go hand in hand. So if you learn less, but you learn more in depth, then your examinations are more in depth about less things, but they are more comprehensive.
I feel like it also is capable to have a very productive classroom with this kind of this mindset, I guess. I know a lot of the classrooms I've been in, we've had the lecture format, but then when we're going and reviewing the material and going to really solidify it, that's the point where we implement these kind of games and stuff. I talked about my French class in in the podcast, and it was we would learn all the material, but then we would go and play games afterwards, after we actually learned it. And I feel like if you're really effective about implementing it as a teacher, and if all the students are on board for it, I feel like you could fit in everything that you wanted to time-wise.
I have one final question. You mentioned in your podcast project-based learning, which is a very popular approach, especially in Georgia Tech. Can y'all give us an example of what you think an effective example of project-based learning that might be on the more creative, playful sides of things?
So an example, say from our
Yeah,
experiences,
or what you think is
okay.
either your own experience or what you think might be a useful model.
So in an AP biology, just to give an example, in my AP biology class last year, in order to sort of learn about the immune system, we had to do a project in which we visually represented the immune system. That's really all the restriction we were given. We were given just a very basic, we want you to demonstrate this. We had learned the material in a very traditional way. And what we did was we went off and divided into, I think, 6 groups or so. And each one of us came up with a different idea on how we were going to visually represent this. I know my group personally built a castle out of cardboard to represent the body, and we did all these things, put all these figures in there that represented these different aspects. And so that created it sort of solidified what we were doing. And so that's just one example of a way in which it helps to be a general also, but also having learned the material, we also knew what we had to incorporate. So we knew the specifics, but we're given a general idea. And so we were allowed to be creative within the restriction of the material.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you very much.